So without further ado, because this is a short session, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Kate Roach, who is or was an academic and is a writer with a background in social sciences with lots of really diverse interests from the intersections between story and real world context and between reason and magic, which I love. She's taught engineers about pitfalls of mad science, which is also fantastic, and historians about belief, science and the vampire. Kate's also worked in television production and as a freelance science writer, and has recently left academia, much to the envy of some of us, to make more space for her writing. So I'm going to pass over to Kate, who's going to speak about Dracula, forensics and folklore.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. So just to say a quick word about me, I mean, Diane said it all really, thank you, Diane. But I just did want to say you might wonder why someone from engineering is suddenly, what are you doing messing around with vampires? I've always messed around with vampires, of all kinds maybe, I should say, as I'm sure many of us have. So I'm actually a social scientist, so I didn't study literature. I started out really in kind of the cultural studies end of social sciences, and what that meant for me was of doing a PhD which had these two stories. With these two stories, and I don't know if you recognize them, I imagine that you certainly would. So on the right hand side, obviously Frankenstein and mad science, and on the left hand side, Dracula. Now, my PhD was really about what does science do in the world of culture, in the world of stories that people, read to one another in the reading groups in the 19th century bars. What science was there? Did science do anything to those stories? And what I found was that there was a change in the Gothic narrative. So the first Gothic period begins at the end of the 18th century, so much older, it's before the 19th century. And those stories tend to have an aristocratic villain who pursues a very innocent, should we say, woman of social order, of lower social order. So there's a power imbalance. And there's someone aristocratic, someone a bit like a count, I like to think. And then by the end of the century, none of the Gothic stories have this kind of setup. And they no longer, those setups basically had no hero. There was no detective, there were no police, there was no Van Helsing, there was no one to help fight the monsters. What happened was the Gothic heroine was able to get through her trial, if you like, through her genius, and her genius would always have been, she was able to balance thinking and reason with feeling. And this was a sort of a really important debate of the day in the late 18th century when I started my study. And in the late 18th century, we certainly do have reference to a lot of vampires. So now just with that background, we're going somewhere which is quite similar in the sense that I live, and please join me in a world where characters and events are just exaggerated way beyond reality so that they become more symbolic. They become like thoughts and feelings rather than real characters, complex characters in some of these narratives. And so these kind of works, popular Gothic work, almost challenge us to go beyond, well, if we're trying to look for meaning, they challenge us to go beyond believing word as fact, which is what we sort of most of us would like to do, I think. So vampires, of all the revenants, of all the things that come back from the dead, vampires are very special. They were discovered in 1725 on the borders of the Habsburg Empire. So I followed quite closely particularly when I was teaching. I've been teaching a vampire course at UCL for some years now, which is run by the Department of Slovak and Eastern European Studies. So we had great fun with that. And one of the best books that I read for that was Nick Groom's book, The Vampire, A New History, I should say. So in that book, he shows how a scientific and a rationalized interest, an enlightenment, so-called enlightenment, which was happening. Enlightenment means a sort of, we're enlightened by reason and science, and we were enlightened in the 18th century in the UK, perhaps would begin to be. So this, he says, the vampires of old, he talks of as the traditional bloodsuckers of Eastern European folklore, and they come face to face with empirical science and become vampires in one. So in other words, what he's saying is, without the attention of these professional people who were interested in death and what happens after the body has died and whether can the body reanimate, all of these things were not known and were very interesting. And many clergy were also very suspicious of it, so they wanted to know about it as well because they wanted to administer it, to stop it. And so the first vampire in the UK is this chap called Arno Pauli. He was a mercenary, and he lived at a time when there had been a treaty which kind of meant that certain parts of Hungary, Serbia, became part of the Austrian Empire. And that meant that soldiers who were there garrisoned in these outposts were observing different customs to their own. And this is how, in a way, we think that the vampire myth really kind of came out. It must have come out before this because these myths have been around for a long time. But anyway, the story of Arno Pauli, and this was written down by state officials, by clergy and medics who were kind of stamped by the state. So it was given a lot of credibility. So 20 days after the death of Arno Pauli, some are claiming to be bothered by him and 4 have died. 40 days after the death, local people dig him up and put a stake in his heart. When the body importantly groans and bleeds profusely, blood is a very common, a lot of blood is a common feature of folkloric vampires. So he was then burned, and 4 of his so-called victims were treated in the same way. So more bodies exhumed, more reported to contain fresh blood. And the case was reported by officials. And this was picked up by the press, and it was reported, this was the first case that was reported in the UK in 1732, so a few years later. But before I go on, I just want to say it's really important to understand that all of these folkloric vampires differ markedly from place to place. So, some would go back only to their family home and drink wine and kind of act like a poltergeist without actually drinking blood. Others would suffocate their victims, others would drink blood. I think that it's important to have some key features of vampires in mind in this world so that we can understand, okay, when are we talking about what we think of as a vampire? So I think there's a common theme across most of them of living in death. There's a common theme of just being driven by appetite. Now, this is where I was saying just a moment ago that the 18th century had an obsession with, do we think or do we feel? Is it best to think first or feel first? And how should we act and how should we proceed? And vampires are all appetite. They're all feeling. They just get what they want, and that's that. And the other thing that's really important is that there's some form of contagion, so that if you are bitten by a vampire, then you will become a vampire, or potentially at least you will become a vampire. And so fresh blood is an important theme, as are this sort of living after death, and the signs that there's no smell in the coffin, all kinds of signs, new skin, new nails, those were things, a kind of ruddiness. These are all things that reportedly corpses can go through. But, local people dug up corpses and found them in this state and felt that this was a sign of something else. Presumably, a large part of it was that these vampire outbreaks coincided with outbreaks of disease, but I don't know the truth of that. So what we end up with is this horrible sort of, on the left-hand side, bloated vampire. Found one, the headshot is actually a model that you could go and buy on Etsy if you want. But the little inset is the incubus from Fuseli's painting The Nightmare, who sits on a woman's chest as she's sleeping. And essentially, folkloric vampires, the things that are common to them make them more into this kind of animal, this kind of creature. Far more like this kind of creature, at least, than Bela Lugosi, who is the quintessential Dracula for me. But I had a good look at Dracula images because I thought, are there any better ones? And I mean, they're so similar across the board, really. So we have this sort of very debonair character. So how do we get from one to the other? Are they even the same story? I'm just going to read you, and then we can skip the next slide. So Polidori in 1819 wrote of the vampire, in spite of the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion. Though its form and outline were beautiful, many of the female hunters after notoriety attempt to win his attentions and gain at least some marks of what they might term affection from Lord Ruthven. Lord Ruthven is Polidori's vampire. And of Dracula we understand that his face was strong, a very strong aquiline, high bridge of a thin nose and particularly arched nostrils, with a lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily around the temples. His eyebrows were massive, almost meeting over the nose, with bushy hair that curled in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy moustaches, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lip, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality for a man of his age. For the rest, his ears were pale and at the tops extremely pointed, the chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. So there's this sense of, the one thing that really shouts out as different between all of the folkloric vampires almost and this one is the pallor, which is ruddy and rosy for the folkloric vampires. But again, how does it happen? And my sense here is that Stoker harks right back, I think, to the Gothic traditions of the 18th century. I mean, all the Gothic writers do, actually, anyway, following that. But I think that there is an image of this kind of aristocratic male who is licentious and greedy and driven by appetite, who is human in the Gothic fictions of the late 18th century, but I think might have turned vampiric in Stoker's hands. And I think it's very, very clever, because what this now does is rationalise, and with the help, I must say, of Derby Dracula, because that actually set, although Stoker, Polidori, these fictions, Varney the vampire would be the same, these fictions set up the Count as he is. In a way, it was Derby Dracula who showed him in the Cape. So there was certainly some additions there which gave us Bela Lugosi and the famous kind of vampire that we know and love. So we've got to think about are they the same story? How do we get from one to the other, going back to that? And what I'm going to do now is just show you a tiny little tidbit of research that I've done, that I'm beginning to do as part of a bigger project, to look at that period between, we know about vampires that have been discovered in Serbia. I'll come on to what we do with them But it's 1732 to 1819. For that period, there are no vampire stories in fiction, certainly none that do well. And given there's been a lot of Gothic monsters already in that period, there's still been no vampire. So, I don't know why that is, but I've been digging around and I'll share that with you. So the vampires in the UK press report on who they call Paul Arnold of Serbia. And actually, they quote directly from the statement that was made about that vampire. But almost immediately after this, there is an article I come across. So like it's a couple of months later. And this is an article that it's part of an argument about vampires as as metaphors for some politicians. And essentially what they're arguing about is whether there's a piece in the Craftsman, and then there's another piece in the London magazine which answers to it. And these two pieces are discussing whether we could use the vampire story as a metaphor for some politicians. And here there is this quote: "What is a more common praise for a ravenous minister?" And this is a minister of state. "For a ravenous minister, even in this part of the world, than a leech or a bloodsucker. And a plundering minister carries his oppressions beyond the grave and continues to torment those he leaves behind him by anticipating public revenues and entailing a perpetuity of taxes and gables upon the people." Several other influences of similitude are given between the story of vampires and political vampires. So this story immediately is associated with bloodsuckers and leeches. There's some sense here of draining a victim of life force. And almost immediately from there, I then find a whole plethora of metaphors that we know about that are used in the vampire world. So we have the political vampire I've just talked about, and then the very famous Irish vampire, which is used variously to refer to English landlords, absentee landlords, and that kind of thing. And I'm sure I will be able to find something Scottish. I must be able to in that period. It also is quite interesting. It gets mixed up with this picture here, which is middle bottom. The coloured picture is actually a picture of cannibals. I don't know if you can tell. And then just above that is a picture of body snatchers, an illustration of body snatchers. It gets used to describe cannibals because there is a case of cannibalism in 1825 in Van Diemen's Land, where they used to send prisoners that they no longer wanted to have to deal with. So, and there literally was apparently a case of cannibalism, and they talk about this as, well, I read this quote: "Alexander," this person's, the criminal, the murderer was known as, "Alexander was arraigned for murder of a fellow prisoner. Reporters associated the prisoner with cannibals, and recollecting as we did the vampire legends of modern Greece, we confess that on this occasion our eyes glanced in fearfulness at the being who stood before a retributive judge, laden as he was with the weight of human blood and believed to have banqueted on human flesh." So this is also these two worlds. There's very murky worlds around death that I don't know about the cannibalism. I think that's quite an unusual thing, but the body snatching stuff is not at all unusual. It was very current through the 18th and 19th and some of the 19th century up until about the 1830s, I think, the Anatomy Act, which involved stealing bodies and then selling them to surgeons for dissection. So vampires kind of got caught up in that whole, associated with, let's put it like that, with that world. On sort of odd, random and lighter notes, there is a racehorse called, a line of racehorses called the Vampire, which belonged to Lord Sandwich in the 18th century, is still going. The line is still going. I'm assuming it's not the same horse in the 19th century. And that's constantly being reported on in the press as having won or lost this, that or the other. There is very famously a theatrical device called a vampire trap, which was invented in the 1820s for the play The Vampire. And ladies are advised that our complexions are so important that we mustn't make it dingy, our complexion, by carelessness, coarse through intemperance, or sallow by dissipation. And this one talks about, then says, for unless the passions are held in obedience to the gentle curb of virgin or matron reason, all prescriptions will be vain to repress these boiling humours from mounting to the surface, which, in spite of all the cosmetics of Bond Streets, will spread themselves to cheek and brow, and there show the outward and visible sign of a disordered spirit within. So that little piece also invokes feeling and thinking, this constant sort of opposition between reason and passion. So what I propose that exists is a kind of gap, a sort of 1732 to 1819 gap in vampire stories, which is filled by this building of an understanding and a meaning around the vampire. And I think one of the issues about vampire stories themselves would be that vampires may not be something that polite, can I put that in? I'm putting that inverted commas in case you're not looking at me, but polite readers wouldn't read at the end of the 18th century. And really they're the ones that are reading the Gothic fiction. So there isn't a mass market for fiction until sort of begins to start to grow in the 1830s, when the taxes are reduced on newspapers and advertising and things like that. So I am fundamentally really interested in what happens in between. These kind of little metaphorical bits of newsprint I've given you were just an example of some of the things that I have begun with and some of the themes that I've started with. But I think I should leave that there because it's time for us all to go. And thank you for listening. I hope it made sense.
Thank you so much, Kate. There were lots of really great gems and nuggets in there. Lots of appreciation I can see on the screen. I'm not sure if we've really got time for questions because we need to finish quite tightly, but I'd just like to note Matt's comment in the chat. He said it's really interesting how these metaphors end up in Marx and political economy in general. Blood is obviously still used as a metaphor for cash, kind of infusions. So that's
yeah, absolutely
prevalent. And it made me think about, we've probably not really got time to discuss, but it made me think about how folklore kind of prompts science to fill in some gaps.
Yeah.
But particularly how then maybe that science creates new folklore and its own mythologies. So I think that might be something interesting to look at.
Very.
And you were talking about this gap as well. Have you, and I've just said I won't ask any questions, but I'm going to take chair's privilege just to ask you one brief question. I wonder if you've looked at collections of folklore and folk tales rather than necessarily official published fiction. If you look into kind of like Catherine Briggs's folk tales and those kinds of texts, you might be able to fill some gaps in that way. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think more folklore would be better. And I'm not a folklorist, so it wouldn't be the first place I go. I would sort of, I'm very much about looking in being led by what's in the media or what's in the newsprint or what are people talking about. But they are talking about folklore, you know, so it might be there rather than in fiction. I think there's something about fiction and folklore that I need to dig into that differs. and it's something to do with publication and a feeling of one thing being okay and one thing not at that time, I'm saying as well, not necessarily now.
Yeah. I'm sure there's folklorists like Matt and myself and other people who would be more than happy to point you in the right direction. So I'm afraid because we've run over a bit, we should probably wind up there because one of our promises of these lunchtime bites is that they are bite-sized. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody, and just kind of show our appreciation for Kate once again before we all head off.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks very much,
Kate.